Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nicole Siegel, and I am the Senior Education Communications Manager here at Third Way. These are overwhelming, difficult, and uncertain times, and it looks like Unprecedented is making a strong campaign to be Merriam-Webster's 2020 Word of the Year. So thank you for taking the time to join us today for what we know will be a dynamic and illuminating conversation with Dr. Freeman Hrabowski, President of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. This conversation is the second in a series of conversations that the Third Way Education team will be hosting over the next few months, in which we will engage influencers and thought leaders in the conversations happening around higher education and the federal response to coronavirus. The first conversation with Congresswoman Donna Shalala is available to view on our website. American colleges have long been viewed as a pillar of strength in our society. But what happens when the pillar abruptly flips upside down? Our country is currently facing two public health crises, COVID-19 and racism. Two crises, one moment in history. So today, we're going to look behind the curtain at the role of colleges during challenging times and explore what today's current events mean for the future of our nation's higher ed system. Before we formally kick off the conversation, I want to first go over a few logistical details. First, the hope is for everyone on today's call to have the opportunity to ask questions, which you are able to do using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. I'll go through a few questions that I've prepared first, and then we'll read through questions that are submitted to me. I also want to note that this conversation will be recorded, so if there are things you miss or will want to reference again, you will be able to do so at a link that will be posted on Third Way's website following this conversation. So without further delay, I'd like to quickly introduce one of my personal higher education heroes, Dr. Hrabowski. Dr. Hrabowski has been at the helm of UMBC for nearly 3 decades. In this role, he's worked to create an environment that helps underrepresented students, specifically African American, Latino, and low-income learners, get degrees in math and science. In fact, the university produces more African American alumni that go on to pursue and earn MD, PhDs than any other college in the country. Dr. Hrabowski was named by President Obama to chair the President's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for African Americans. He's been named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time Magazine and one of America's best leaders by US News and World Report. And UMBC has been recognized as a model for inclusive excellence by publications like US News. His TED Talk on the 4 pillars of college success in science has over 1 million views. He holds honorary degrees from more than 40 institutions. And perhaps most notably, he claims to never forget the name of one of his students. So as you can see, there is simply no one better equipped to have a conversation about the important role colleges and universities play in American society than Dr. Hrabowski himself. Dr. Hrabowski, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Nicole. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
We're so delighted to have you. So let's jump right in. At the age of 12, you persuasively convinced your parents to let you participate in the Children's Crusade March for Civil Rights in your hometown of Birmingham, Alabama. This resulted in your arrest, where you spent 5 days in jail. Given the current climate, I'd be remiss if I didn't start by asking you to address this issue. What do you see as higher education's role when it comes to advancing civil rights and helping students better understand their history and power to make change?
Let me start by thanking you for having me today and for your very kind introduction. I should tell you that the longer the introduction, the older the person. So it's always mixed emotions that I hear those introductions. I have to start by saying that as a child, I was privileged to listen to Dr. King, to sit in the audience. And he said something to me that I would want to say to every child today. He said, tomorrow can be better than today. And he went on to say that the time would come when we could go to better schools. And I was tired of the hand-me-down books. We had some great teachers. They didn't have the resources. And it was the first time I began to believe that perhaps there was something I could do to make a difference. And the point I'm making is that empowering young people to understand the challenges we face, structural racism, but also what they can do to make a difference, to eradicate this discrimination, has to be the most important thing that universities can do today. And so I am saying to my students and colleagues, we have to find ways of preparing our students and ourselves to understand the intricate parts of this problem that we face, that police brutality is just one part of it, that you got education issues and academic achievement gap and health disparities and income. And the question is, how do we go about working on all those things? Well, universities teach us to think. And what I would argue is that to the extent that universities teach us to think and to put ourselves in the shoes of other people, we will be effective in working on these problems, so that what Dr. King said to me over 50 years ago can continue to become a reality.
Thank you. The last few months have been a whirlwind for our nation's higher education system, to say the least. Physical campuses closed across all 50 states, sending nearly 20 million students packing. When it became clear that UMBC would need to close its campus facilities that serve 14,000 students, a mammoth and complex operation, what's the very first thing you did?
Call our campus leaders together. Breathe deeply first. Let me just say that, to breathe deeply and to imagine, is this real, right? And as a leader, we have to, I say breathe deeply because we've got to get ready to have an attitude of hope that we can get through this. The worst thing a leader can do is to suggest gloom and doom. Yes, this is going to be really hard, but we can do it. And I was telling you before, I always get inspiration from our students. And so we did have conversations, very quickly had conversations with student and faculty and staff leaders. I mean, that term shared governance has real meaning. If you want to make a difference on a campus, listen to what people are saying, their concerns are, what are their questions, what's the advice they have for you. And so since we knew, based on talking with people in our entire system, the university system of Maryland, the direction in which the state was going, we had a sense of what others were doing. We needed to get to our leaders to make sure our approach would be a reasonable one, and then we needed to get ready to communicate as effectively as possible.
Somewhat relatedly, how has your role as university president evolved during the pandemic?
It's done for me what it's done for you and for all of us, and that is we've all had to look in the mirror. It's just ironic that my colleagues and I had just written a book called The Empowered University on looking at self in the mirror. And we've been saying that somehow it's prophetic, because this is a time when we all, as a society, as individuals, as universities, have to look in the mirror and say, okay, what's really important to us? What is it we want to make sure when we come out of this, we are still holding on to as tightly as possible? And we have two guiding principles. And this period has allowed me and my colleagues both to examine those values that we consider most important, and to decide what we're willing to fight for. What is it that's most important? And there are two things we say. They're very simple. The first has had to do with just the human beings, the health and safety of people. What are the things we're going to have to do to make sure people are safe, our students and colleagues, and healthy in every possible way? That's number one. And then after that human quality, what do we do to make sure we continue to make academic progress, the academic program, starting with students and teaching and learning, with faculty and research? I mean, those are at the heart of what we do. That part of that academics is engaging in the community, but it comes out of the academic program. So those are the two things. And we have, in this process, learned just how important it is to stick to those values, to those guiding principles, and to understand what it means to show leadership in a time of adversity. And for me, the theme has to be elevation. You know, as you were talking about what's unprecedented, just as this is an unprecedented time, it is also an unprecedented opportunity for people to show how important it is to reach out to other people. and to give support. So I'm getting emails and text messages and calls from people students I haven't heard from in a month or two or more, and others just saying, are you okay? You know, and that, you know, in the same way, I have to say with the civil protests, to see people of all races out there in the street, sometimes with their children, saying, it may not be me, but it's my fellow citizen, my fellow human being, and I'm out here. That's a part of it. That's also unprecedented, because the protests that I participated in the 50s, in the 60s was not like that. Mm-hmm. It was mainly blacks and a few whites. This has been all of us saying, this is wrong. Structural racism is wrong. So the same thing with the COVID, we're all saying, this is bad. This is dangerous. We have to stick together and listen to all of the experts if we're going to get through this. Mm-hmm. And that's what we've learned.
Thank you. So as I mentioned earlier, you have been at the helm of UMBC for quite some time, impressively since May of 1992. During those 28 years, there have been some other significant and historically relevant events requiring university guidance and leadership, namely 9/11. How did being in the role of crisis manager post 9/11 prepare you to lead during the coronavirus pandemic? And were there any successful strategies you implemented then that you found to also be successful now?
Because it's such a great question, because we learn in every challenging situation. And I'll never forget the theme that came out of that 9/11 period. And even then, I'd already been president almost 10 years, was community. Mm-hmm. We have so many students from other countries. We have kids from 100 countries on our campus, every race, every religion, very diverse place. And some of our students from certain parts of the world were really experiencing negative, ugly behavior off the campus. And they were really scared because people were judging them and assuming things just because they were Muslim, for example, or from the Middle East or whatever. And we got that. And what was wonderful was to hear my students of all backgrounds saying, we must support each other. And those who are most vulnerable need the most support. And so right after that, we had and a lot of my students are from military families, others from diplomatic families. They get that sense of the global economy. But we came together that night in a candlelight vigil. Every slice of humanity, every religion, every race, and we talked about what it means to be an American, yes. And then even more important, and I say that deliberately, what it means to be a human being, humankind, and how those two things fit together, and how America is this wonderful collection of people from all over the world, not a melting pot, no, with that distinctiveness in many ways, with some things in common, and the students led it. Let me say that. The students gave me my role, asked me, they told me what they wanted me to do. And they did say, Doc, you got to elevate us. You got to let us know we're going to get through this. But we're going to do this, this, and this. And so, again, what we do at UMBC, we call retriever courage. And we use it in so many different ways. Ours is retriever is the dog, our mascot. So retriever courage we use. And you'll see that for Title IX. You'll see it for all kinds of things. And it's about listening to people, listening to the voices of people affected by whatever the situation is. And that is exactly where we are today. As we think about listening to our colleagues as they are moving online, as we think about students having different experiences with that, as we think about students from all kinds of income backgrounds, students who didn't have a computer, didn't have Wi-Fi in their homes, listening to understand what they needed. And so all of that I would put under the umbrella of building community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Shifting directions a little bit. And you should correct me if I'm wrong on these figures. UMBC received a little over $9 million in total aid from the CARES Act. A little more than $4.5 million was designated for emergency aid to students. Yes. How have you used, or are you using that money, and how did you decide where to spend it? Tell us a little bit about that process.
Sure. First of all, we made a decision early on to give refunds to students. So the residence halls closed the first part of March. It was only fair. There were certain fees they shouldn't have to pay. They're not on campus, so they shouldn't have a parking fee, for example. They shouldn't have the athletic fee because they're not taking advantage of that. And so we ended up giving back millions and millions, as other campuses did, millions and millions of dollars for those things. And so we used that 9 million, over half, not quite 5 million, went directly for students, for expenses they were dealing with, directly to them. And then the other went to begin defraying all the expenses we had as a result of giving back the millions and millions, 6, 7 times that amount of money. So it just began to help us a bit. With the goal being to be as financially strong as we can be under these very difficult times, understanding that our goal is to support people during this process. People are always worried about job security, you know that. And we have in every crisis, we work to keep people feeling, no, we're here together and we'll make it through this because we need you and you need us. And so the money went just to the very broad expenses in that sense.
Thank you. I think you're gonna like this question. Taken directly from UMBC's website, your institution is connected by a shared sense of mission and vision. You combine grit and supportive community to reach excellence across the board. The classroom, the lab, the concert hall, on stage, and on the court, go Retrievers. So in a time of increasing isolation, how has UMBC approached creating meaningful connections while being physically apart?
Yes, it's such a great question. Again, all your questions are great though, Nicole. They really are. Let me tell you, the people, our communications team and our student leaders, our faculty leaders, our staff leaders have been working consistently to find ways to pull more people into conversations, whether they're in town hall meetings, in focus groups, in webinars, in workshops. We've got hundreds of faculty right now going through additional professional development for online instruction. We've always done a lot involving technology in our work. About half the students are in STEM, the other half in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. But we've got a great team of people in technology and faculty development and with students to use the technology to be deliberate in ensuring that we are both listening to the voices of people, but also facilitating conversations among groups about what they're facing. So we've got things during the civil unrest. We've got all kinds of departmental work going on, and not just letters, but opportunities for people to come together, for faculty of color, for African Americans, for others on our campus, common space to discuss what they're going through, opportunities, student-centered webinars for students to understand what's going on in the society right now, for issues involving healthcare and COVID, issues involving people who didn't have a computer or didn't have the Wi-Fi capability, or in some way or another were really feeling frustrated, how we make sure they get the help that they need. So what matters, it seems to me, is that our attitudes can make a difference. If we have an attitude that says no one is to be left behind, we want to make sure we're being as effective as possible in helping our students. And most important, we want to take feedback. We've put up all kinds of structures so that students or their parents or families can say, this is going well, this is not going well. And we want to get back to them quickly. They need to know we're in this thing together, and we will make mistakes, yes. But if you let us know, we'll work on it immediately. You know, there's a saying that I use with new students that comes from years ago. Your parents and my age would have said to the new students, look at the student to your left, look at the student to your right. One of you will not graduate. That is a standard statement. What I've always felt, and my colleagues agree, that's a terrible thing to say to new students. Because if I'm at all immature, I'm thinking, oh my God, he's talking about me, so I may as well have a good time because I'm not going to be here next year anyway. So we say, look at the student to your left, look at the student to your right. Our goal is to make sure all three of you succeed and graduate. And if you don't, we fail, and we don't plan to fail. And that attitude is even more important during a time when we are all experimenting with use of technology more heavily than ever before. So attitude makes a difference, a proactive approach to connecting people to the community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That segues very nicely into my next question. The impacts of COVID-19 on college students across the country are far-reaching, and some of the students who are being hit the hardest are our most vulnerable populations. low-income students, first-generation students, and students of color. What is UMBC doing to provide additional support, specifically mental health services and emergency funds to these students right now?
Yeah, let's start with the emergency funds. We have put aside extra money for financial aid beyond what the federal government did, but we've been fundraising and have raised hundreds of thousands of dollars to help people with it. And we put in place an infrastructure that allows them to get that money whenever possible, listening to their need. And we can't give them all the money they want, but in many cases, we've been able to give them support. And we keep growing that fund because there's so many students, both traditional age and returning students, returning women, for example, who do have those needs. There's no doubt about that. So we're doing the fundraising. And the other part, through Student Affairs, we have been using telemedicine, telecounseling in many ways, giving people opportunities to be heard, to ask questions, to get information. The name of the game is responsiveness, being responsive. What do you need? Let us help you out. And the great thing that I love about UMBC is that it's our faculty and our staff are helping that, but students are helping students a lot. And our student leaders have this as a part of their agenda. Let's make sure we're listening to what our students are saying and get the message across when we see somebody falling through the cracks. Because that's the biggest challenge, whether you're on campus or through technology, is somebody not to let us know what's going on and they kind of just fall through the cracks. So we're using analytics to make sure people are responding, to make sure that the students are asking the questions, to make sure we know how students are doing on that mental health side and on the academic side, both. Because we're all, by the way, we also create a culture that says, this is a stressful time for each of us. If you're staying at home, I don't care how much you love the people at home, at some point, everybody gets on everybody's nerves. And I'm always telling everybody, don't forget unconditional love. My wife has to have unconditional love because I get on her nerves all the time. She is so ready for me to be back on campus, right? But humor, that's the other point I'm making, that in the midst of all these challenging times, there's something about humor in the midst of the crime that helps to balance it and that allows us to keep moving ahead.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
There's a perception that online-only education is less rigorous or valuable than in-person instruction. It's this perception that we've seen kind of post-COVID result in some students across the country request a reduction in their tuition. What are your thoughts on that push from some students, and how do we ensure quality of online instruction?
It's a great question, and we have looked at it very carefully. This online instruction is going to be even more expensive than in person for a lot of reasons. We are developing new techniques and methods of educating. Years from now, I am convinced people will look back and say, with all the clouds around this, there was a silver lining. And it is that more and more of our colleagues are understanding this is a part of the future. I think you're going to be seeing hybrid in many ways, a hybrid approach, both the combination for many people who are fortunate for face-to-face, but also opportunities for doing things online with all kinds of programs. And we had been doing some of that before. We're doing far more of that now, but it does cost more money. There's hundreds of faculty going through professional development this summer. It's not just expensive, but in terms of the time of people in order to do a good job. What I would say to you is this. My TED Talk talks about the fact the majority of Americans of all races who begin in science and engineering do not continue in science and engineering. And number one reason is they end up getting that C or D and they get discouraged. That's just reality. I chaired the National Academy's committee on that. That's for every race, men and women. And I'm telling you, 2/3. Now that's with regular, traditional instruction. But we as Americans have just accepted the idea that we call the first year of science and engineering weed-out courses. You see, so I mean, and most people, many who are lawyers, will tell you they started off from pre-med. This is the reality. So what I'm saying is, let's not assume that everything we were doing before was that great in certain disciplines. The fact is, and the more prestigious the university, the greater the probability in many cases that that student with the very high SAT leaves science within the first year or two. So that's a challenge that we face in general. And what I would argue is this is giving us a chance to use creative approaches in the combination of face-to-face, we're face-to-face right now, with technology, in order to make sure we are rethinking our way of assessing learning and to make sure students are grasping the concepts. My point is we can do a much better job of teaching and learning, especially in certain disciplines in STEM areas. Now, at the same time, I have been thrilled to hear a literature professor talking about the intimacy of her work in her seminar through this approach we're using right now, and the ability to see the face and the reaction and to get writing. And so while I talk about STEM for a minute and the challenges there, I would argue that we have to make sure that we are still elevating and emphasizing arts, humanities, and social sciences in these settings, just because of what they bring to the table as we think about solving the problems that we experience in humankind.
Thank you. I'm already seeing a bunch of, unsurprisingly, questions come in from our audience. So folks should feel free to continue to submit questions. I will move over to Q&A in a few minutes. But you mentioned briefly, you touched on the science program at UMBC, which is an enviable science program. So it should have come as no surprise to me when I was browsing the UMBC website. University faculty are working on research related to coronavirus. So I'd love if you could just spend a few minutes talking about the prestigious FAST grant 2 of your science professors received from the National Institutes of Health, and what specifically their research is focused on.
Sure, Dr. Seeley Radke, Kathy, is a chemist and brilliant chemist who's been a Jefferson Fellow before, and she works on antiviral compounds and that are to act against COVID-19. She's testing them right now. These are viruses. The compounds she's developed have actually worked in some of the other diseases, from SARS to Ebola. And so she's got extremely effective compounds, and they're testing them right now. And we're very hopeful that something will come of that. She's highly regarded with that. The other one is an interesting one, as you think about, Dr. Chia has a grant to look at discrimination against Chinese Americans during COVID, because of all the challenges as we think about intervention strategies to help with that. Because you remember a month or 2 ago, especially, people, because of a lot of comments that were made, really difficult situation that people of Chinese backgrounds were experiencing, in the same way that we had challenges during 9/11. And so remember, NIH looks at things involving the life sciences, but they also bring in psychology in those other areas. But I mean, our alumni are very involved. I am really proud of 2 of them. One is Dr. Sattler, Sadtler, who is a wonderful woman at NIH who went to UMBC, Hopkins, and MIT for the postdoc, and she is leading the NIH study on the impact of the asymptomatic patients on the spread of the disease, something everybody's hearing about from WHO right now, the transmission. And the other one is Kismikia Corbett, who is, by the way, African-American. It's very unusual for us to hear this. An African-American scientist who has led the NIH study leading to the vaccine that is now in phase 2 at Moderna, in fact. She's a graduate of UMBC, then went to Chapel Hill for the PhD, came back at NIH. And so we've got these women and people of color and people in general, scientists, alumni, and faculty who are right in the middle of all of it. The Surgeon General is another one of our graduates who's working on these issues also.
Thank you so much.
Excuse me for...
I'm going to move to a few questions from the audience. The first is from Lindsay Ellis of Chronicle of Higher Education. Hi, Lindsay. On your comments on looking in the mirror, Dr. Hrabowski, higher education is being forced to reckon with institutional racism as it faces the coronavirus pandemic. If college leaders lose their community's trust in this moment, what is at stake?
Yes, it's such a very appropriate question. What's at stake is this: families trust, of all types, trust universities to send their family members, whether it's their children, spouses, partners, to better themselves and to prepare them for the world. And we know that most of our leaders in this country have been are the products of our institutions. And so there are two things I would say. One, I say when I'm working with new presidents in the Harvard program, all the people in Washington are our graduates. Think about it for a minute. And we see people we really like, people we may not in terms of what they say, but it said to me well before this, we can do a better job. We have to teach people to listen to other perspectives much more. And we have to teach people how to have the courage to speak the truth. You know, what's encouraging about this period, as hurtful as it is it's shining light on the truth, and the world is looking at us. And people are going to want to know what university leaders, and that's presidents, but it's also the faculty, it's our student and staff leaders, what we're willing to do to address these very painful truths. The fact that certain groups have not been treated fairly, that you've got disproportionate numbers of Blacks in prison right now, the fact that the health disparities are as they are, and I can go on, the fact that so many children cannot read. You know, so it will be up to us in universities to go beyond the courageous statement about structural racism, but to go into action. The last piece that we put out yesterday from UMBC talks about some of the things we're working to do right now, both to help our students, our African Americans, and others who are really bothered and in difficulty and pain right now, but also to talk about, okay, now beyond the protest, what do we do? And so there are a number of things we talk about. For example, being involved in this democracy, getting people to vote. We don't want to tell people whom to vote for, but we can talk about values we may all agree are important. So the idea of voting at every level, as President Obama said, as one idea. The idea of service, of getting involved in helping our children, of questioning policies, not just in terms of police, but in terms of healthcare, in terms of education. So there is a very important role for all of us to play. And I am more encouraged now than I've been in my 50 in higher education, that we will be more honest this time. And let me just say something that people have been uncomfortable saying, that race does matter. Yes, other things matter too. Of course, gender matters, LGBTQ, all these, we want to talk about all these, but for a while, people have gotten away from saying race. They're just thinking, well, you had a Black president, so race doesn't matter. That's just not true. You know, and I think we have to say it, call it by its name. It is structural racism, but then explain what it means. That's where universities can be very important through the social sciences and humanities in reflecting on and understanding the dimensions of this discrimination that we're talking about.
Thank you. I have two questions here that are somewhat related. So in real time, I'm going to try to modify them into one. So kind of part one, I'll say part one and part two, and then throw it to you. How many scenarios is UMBC considering for the fall semester, and which do you see as most likely? And a second question, which I'm very excited about, as the father of an incoming retriever, what should I tell him about what he can expect come the fall semester that will both excite and engage him?
So as the father of an incoming retriever, I want you as the father and the retriever to look in the mirror and say, we are really wise. We're coming to UMBC, right? Number one, I really do want the families to know, parents and others to know that we're putting the health and safety of the students first. And so we're being very careful in the reopening of the physical campus, meaning that they will see things saying that we will still have most of our classes online. We will be more attentive, more supportive than ever before. And we're doing things that others are doing. And for those classes that will be in person, faculty right now are going back and forth to decide which ones they really feel should be in person to whatever extent. But we will have options for students who are not from the area. And even though we may have about half of the students of more upper class, I believe, in the residence halls, you're talking about not even half of the students, because we're saying one person per room, for example. So we're listening to the experts. We've got so many experts here in this area from the University System of Maryland, from the medical school and other places, and they are telling us we should be very conservative in opening the campus, the physical campus. The campus will be open, but physically we will have far fewer students on campus during that first semester, and even those students will be finished with their on-campus experience by Thanksgiving. Because think about it, the worst thing is to let people go away for Thanksgiving and come back and affect things. So we're taking that. So the scenario will be more heavily online than other. That's number one. Number two, if things got really worse, we would even take the few students, that percentage that would be on campus, and move them to online. We've got backup plans for them if things got worse than that. But number three, we are listening to the advice of the experts very carefully, and at the same time, balancing ways of generating revenues and cutting some expenses while protecting people, so that by the second semester, things could be somewhat more normal, we would hope. Okay.
A lot of students are saying they may take a gap year next year because they don't want to do an online only or even a hybrid approach. What would you tell students who are considering that option, and or what support do you think those students might need to ensure they return to school the following year?
Right, I would say two things. Number one, I am a strong believer in continuing to go. Let me just give you my bias. Gap years are great for some people, and they certainly have the right to do that. But for a lot of people, when you take a gap year, the gap gets longer and longer. It's a matter of knowing yourself well enough to know what's best for you. I would start there. Number two, before they make that final decision, I would want them to ask the university, wherever they are, about the things they're most concerned about. And if they hadn't experienced this last semester and they liked some things, and then have they talk with the university about those to see how the university responds, for example, as they make that, just make sure they take all the factors into account as they make their decision. And the other part I would say is some people who take a gap year may decide that they may not want to take as many classes. There's something about continuing the studying process. It's good for people. It really is. I'm studying French right now. The worst thing I could do would be to stop for a month. You know, I've got to je parle français, right? You stop, you lose something in that process. And so I would tell them that even if they're going to take a gap year, they may not want to be a full-time student. Take a few courses. You can do it online. You know, take some courses and keep working it through. But most important for everybody, talk to people at the university and get as much information and get as much help and support as you can. And then you can weigh it most effectively in making your decision. Okay? Mm-hmm.
As you know, the Department of Education regulation for CARES Act money prohibits using any of those funds for undocumented or DACA students. How have you supported those students during this time?
We have been fundraising and making not exceptions to the federal rule, but finding ways of giving students support. There have been students who've worked with us on fundraising efforts themselves. We have donors who are particularly interested in that group who can help us sometimes, and some students who have had jobs online to give them some support. We have students, we have 60% of our students have at least one parent from another country. So we've got this wonderful, just groups of students of all types there, and we're trying to be as helpful to every type of group and situation as possible. And it's all about the individual. When the person needs to borrow a computer, when the Wi-Fi isn't what it needs to be, you know, and it's having an infrastructure that allows you to be as responsive. That word retriever courage means a lot to us. The courage to listen and to look in the mirror and to say, are we being helpful to these students? And I mean, the first time I was telling the faculty senate about this, our going off, the first thing is some of my faculty members, colleagues started saying, what are we going to do about these people who don't have a place to go, for example, right? You know, they don't have a home to go to. Some can't get back to their country. Some can't be at the house in Baltimore City. You know, we're out in the suburbs. And so we have students on campus. We have exceptions. We do, socially distanced, but we've taken those things into account. And the best news is the campus trusts us to listen to those needs and to those who have the most need, for sure.
Thank you. Somewhat relatedly, as the federal government looks to offer additional financial support to the higher education sector in the coming months, what are the greatest financial needs of both students and the entire campus community? What do you think Congress should be thinking about when it comes to further supporting schools and students?
All right, something that may surprise you, I really do think that as the governor of New York has said, as my governor has said, the federal government has to give more support to state and local jurisdictions. They're really important. And they are tied to us in so many ways. Whether we're talking about fire, all the infrastructure issues, we're all in communities, right? And so supporting federal and state jurisdictions will help institutions of all types, quite frankly. But secondly, funds to help us with infrastructure at the universities. And that's infrastructure for the research, which needs to go on, but also funds to help in ensuring that we can continue to teach the classes. I saw a wonderful piece in the New York Times by Frank Bruni, and it's so true. We half our students are STEM, the others are in the liberal arts broadly, and we have to support both. We need to continue to prepare people in literature, in philosophy, in history, just as we do in computer science and biochemistry. And so we cannot let our country become one where it's only vocation. It's got to be one where we have the artists and the others, because they're at the foundation of our society. And we have to remember that in the same way that Eleanor Roosevelt supported the arts during the difficult times of her time. We've got to make sure we continue to do that. And that's not icing on the cake. It's a part of the bread of America.
Thank you. Recognizing that words matter, and it's often much more about how we communicate things and the implementation of new ideas. How do we explain and demonstrate the fact that hybrid education, or maybe online only, is of equal or higher value than in person?
People need to see examples. I would say that there are excellent examples of people teaching completely online in some cases. When Lucille McCarthy, one of my teachers in English, talks about the intimacy of her seminar, and that she was surprised at just how impressive the conversation was and how everybody was working so hard to connect, and they did connect with these ideas, are people who are doing a combination of online and some things in person, that you can have effective teaching and learning in any of those sectors. However, what I would say is this: there's something wonderful about face-to-face whenever possible. Now, we might talk about this as face-to-face. People sometimes forget that online now has become, and the technology is improving. It's better now than it was 3 years ago, right? And so I think I'm more interested in the attitudes of the students and the faculty. And I see some wonderful professors and wonderful students saying, we're gonna get this, we're in this together. And whether it is about Shakespeare or it's about biochemistry, we're going to do this. We're working on things for labs right now. There are some classes where there are different ways of approaching it, whether it's in the arts and others. And so what I'm saying is this: we should not assume that one is necessarily better than the other, because most people don't want to hear me saying that the research shows 2/3 of Americans did not succeed in science and engineering in the face-to-face. Nobody wants to admit that, but only 5% of the Americans in this country have degrees in STEM. It's 10% in Europe. So, most people who are not in STEM don't get it, but everybody who started off in chemistry and moved over to pre-law knows what I'm talking about. So I'm saying in every type of instruction, we can all be better. That's the point. And what's exciting about what we're doing at UMBC is faculty are really working with each other and professional development in strengthening the approaches that we're using.
Thank you. So we're nearly at time, but I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions, one from the audience and then a last one of my own. You've been named one of the most innovative college presidents in modern time. So thinking about leading innovatively during times of crisis, what would you say to future higher education leaders who will be tested in the post-COVID environment?
Number one is
you'd give.
My colleagues in this new book, The Empowered University, I'm shameless, and I make the first sentence of the book says, it's not about me, it's about us. And it's so wonderful the way you said it, that I've been made one of the most innovative leaders. It really is. The university is one of the most innovative. I am lucky to be the president, and maybe I've helped some, but believe me, there are so many innovative people. And the message to leaders is, make sure it's not about you. No. Make sure it's about the people all around you. That sounds so simple, but it's so easy for everybody to point to the president, for example. I know that it has been amazing faculty, administrative staff, and student leaders who've helped us create a culture that focuses on asking good questions. I'm always using I. Rabi's statement. When he was growing up in New York, everybody as a parent would ask him, what'd you learn in school today? He said, not my mother. My mother would say, did you ask a good question today? Did you ask a good question today? That should be on everybody's mind right now. What are the good questions we ask as we think about how we can be stronger at the end of this period of protest and COVID? What are the good questions? That leads to innovation.
Thank you. So to be respectful of your time, final question. If you Google, will COVID-19 change higher education forever, which is something I've Googled far too frequently in the last few weeks, there are 20+ pages of results. And since we have been told that we shouldn't trust everything we read on the internet, it seems wiser to ask someone on the front lines. Do you think the pandemic will alter the college experience altogether? And if so, how?
I'm waiting for the Wi-Fi to start, but can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Yeah. No, we not only will universities will never be the same, human beings will never be the same. And yet, this is my attitude of hope. I think we can be better. You know, we feel so bothered that we cannot be as physically close. People who were hugging, you can't hug, you can't do any of those things right now. But as I said to my students, when we have our masks on, now you'll see people looking in each other's eyes more. You'll see people connecting, not taking for granted things that we'd always taken for granted. The human connection. I honestly believe human connection can be stronger now because we will appreciate what that means. And it may not be in the same way, it may not be in even touching, but there is a way people can connect as human beings, whether it's you and me here, Nicole, on the screen, or it's in a setting where we're socially distant, but we know there's something valuable about human connection, number one. And number two, I think we are learning we cannot afford to accept the idea that the old way is the best way. Mm-hmm. There's always a better way. I mean, the only thing in that I can say that's not a better way is in the human connecting, but we can connect as human beings in different ways, and we can use technology, not to control us, but as a tool, I'm suggesting this is a time for American society and American universities and families and individuals to be empowered, to look in the mirror and to ask that question, how effectively are we connecting? Whether we're talking about helping Black Americans or looking at issues involving kids who don't have computers. Mm-hmm. This is a time for community, and we will be better as a result of this pandemic, of these two pandemics.
Thank you. Dr. Hrabowski, thank you so much for your time and your insights today. I'll speak for myself when I say you've left me, as always, feeling inspired and a little bit more hopeful. And I'm sure the same goes for many of our participants. Thank you again. Be well, stay safe, talk soon.
Keep hope alive.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Bye-bye.